Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, does it feel like social media has all gone a bit quiet in recent months? That might have something to do with the fact that Donald Trump has been banned, imposed after accusations that he incited the violence at the US Capitol in January. Facebook's oversight board has now upheld that ban, for the time being at least, and it's now up to Facebook to decide whether it'll become permanent. Let's get more from our Washington correspondent, Siobhan Kennedy. Siobhan.
Well, Matt, Facebook's decision to ban Trump led to the inevitable outcry about freedom of speech, and Facebook was really looking to pass the buck to its so-called independent oversight board, which incidentally it pays to make a decision about what to do next. But the board has essentially passed the buck right back, saying we uphold your decision, but we're going to give you 6 months to make a decision as to whether or not to make it permanent, which you have to think is a good chance Facebook will do, considering Donald Trump continues to pump out the same rhetoric about the election having been stolen, including today on his new blog, where he also said this of the decision: free speech, he said, has been taken away by the radical left lunatics, none of which, of course, addresses the bigger issue that it was Facebook's own platform and algorithms which in part enabled the riot on January the 6th to take place in the first place. Hence Joe Biden, the president's statement today that social media platforms, he says, have a responsibility to stop amplifying untrustworthy content, misinformation and disinformation, none of which will be addressed by Donald Trump being banned from Facebook or not.
Siobhan Kennedy. Well, earlier I spoke to the venture capitalist Roger McNamee, who's the author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. He's been calling for an overhaul of the way Facebook and other platforms operate. And I began by asking him what he makes of the decision to continue the ban for now on Donald Trump.
I don't think the correct question is whether Donald Trump or anyone else should be banned from Facebook. The correct question is, should Facebook be allowed to operate as it does today at all? I mean, when you look at the United States, for example, Facebook has now had leaked documents that showed the executives were aware of the Stop the Steal movement, which created the insurrection, and chose to do nothing about it. There's a copious evidence that Facebook's algorithms amplified disinformation about COVID, which in the United States had catastrophic results. We also have a case in the state of Texas of price fixing in the digital advertising market, where Google and Facebook apparently conspired to fix prices. In the United States, that is the kind of case that at the federal level usually results in prison sentences for the executives. Facebook doesn't want us talking about any of these issues. What it wants us to do is to argue about whether Donald Trump should be reinstated or not. And in my mind, policymakers around the world have to recognize that self-governance has failed miserably in this category, and that the business model itself is becoming increasingly incompatible with democracy, public health, and the right to self-determination. I'm hopeful that policymakers will look at this as, okay, here's another example of this not working. Let's do something different.
Right, but the question is, what is that something different? Is it outside regulators? And is that even ponderable in the United States?
I think courts are the correct place for those things to be decided. And I do think policymakers need to make really aggressive moves about the business model, not just of Facebook, but of Google and others.
Is there a lot also where it's very hard to bring accountability? I mean, on this program last year, we revealed how the Trump campaign database was using social media to try and deter minorities, especially black voters or Hispanic voters, from even taking part in the election in 2016. And there doesn't seem to be any way to hold Facebook to account for that.
Well, you know, I find this incredibly frustrating, but you're absolutely right. And I think what we're really asking ourselves right now is, what kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a society that is controlled by people like Mark Zuckerberg, a handful of billionaires living on the West Coast of the United States or in China? The strategies of Google and Facebook are driving us towards their choices, not ours. That their whole business plan is based on creating groups of people that they can control.
And do you believe that democracy in America is strong enough and powerful enough to take Facebook on now? Or is Facebook too big?
So that is the challenge we face. I would like to believe the answer is yes. And the reason is because the insurrection that took place at the Capitol on January 6th affected all of the members of Congress, our policymakers are now victims of all of this. And it has taken on a salience for them that it didn't take on before. And I think it's a much greater urgent issue for them than it was before.
Roger McNamee, thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
How does a country that has free speech baked into its DNA, not to mention its constitution, deal with a powerful figure whose repeated lies that can provoke violence? The question perhaps lies at the heart of the decision social media companies took in the hours and days after the attempted insurrection on Washington's Capitol building and the former president's encouragement to his own supporters to overturn the election result. Facebook, you'll remember, banned him indefinitely, Twitter permanently. But today came clarification in the form of a judgment from what's called the Facebook Oversight Board. Trump, they decided, would remain off the platform for now, but the status would be reviewed at intervals. It raises questions about the wisdom of banning a powerful figure from being able to speak their mind, and what, if any, role social media has in stopping that kind of speech there. Where do they go from here? James Clayton reports.
What did the Capitol Hill rioters have in common? A zealot-like love of Donald Trump, sure, but what was also noticeable was how many rioters were recording what they were doing. It was performative, designed for platforms like Facebook. Trump's use of social media is almost impossible to disentangle with Trumpism itself. It was his way of communicating directly with Americans, bypassing the mainstream media that he so loathed. Although Mr. Trump is best known for being on Twitter, it's Facebook where his real political power lay, a hugely important campaign tool. But did he also use that platform to radicalise? Were his posts in part responsible for these deadly riots? Facebook boss Mark Zuckerberg thought Trump's post could lead to further violence and suspended Donald Trump indefinitely the day after the riots. Twitter went one step further and banned Mr. Trump forever. He'll never be allowed back onto that platform. However, Facebook asked its decision to be reviewed by its newly formed oversight board, which it claims is independent. It's designed to make difficult moderation decisions, and their decision today was complex. It said that the Oversight Board has upheld Facebook's decision to suspend Mr. Trump's access to post content on Facebook and Instagram. However, it also said that Facebook couldn't ban Trump indefinitely. The company must reassess this penalty, it said, within 6 months of this decision. The judgment does leave a way back for Trump on Facebook, but for now the door is firmly closed. And that is a huge problem for Donald Trump and his hopes of a political return. In a statement, the former president lashed out, saying Facebook was an embarrassment to our country, and they and other social media companies must pay a political price. Facebook has been essential to Mr. Trump. His campaign used it to raise money and micro-target voters.
He spent more than $200 million in 2020 between his campaign and his PAC on Facebook advertising. He didn't spend $200 million on Twitter advertising or other social media advertising. He spent that on Facebook. So it's not just an opinion that Facebook was an essential part of his political power. He was actually one of the few places where he was putting his money where his mouth was.
The Oversight Board will uphold the ban on Donald Trump.
Republicans are angry. They believe that Facebook and other social media platforms have gone too far, stifling free speech. This was Mr. Trump's former chief of staff earlier, talking on Fox News.
So this is a sad day for America, but a sadder day for the Facebooks of the world who have actually enjoyed a very wild, wild west kind of regulatory environment. I can tell you that's going to change.
The problem that Facebook has here in San Francisco is that it's not just Republicans that are calling for the company to be split up.
Anybody in here a little worried about how Facebook uses your data?
Many Democrats think Facebook is also a monopoly, and far from stifling free speech, it in fact doesn't do enough to stop hate speech. The idea of Facebook being cleaved off from Instagram has been raised as a possible punishment.
Consign him and those who supported him in the Senate to the trash heap of history.
Twitter permanently banning the commander-in-chief's personal account with 88 million followers.
Mr. Trump yesterday released his own communications platform. You can share his content from the website on Facebook and Twitter. It's the former president's attempt to get around the ban. And he's also talked of launching his own social media platform, Trump Book perhaps. But it's really no replacement for being on Twitter or Facebook. At the click of a button, Mr. Trump could beam himself onto the computers and phones of tens of millions of Americans. That button has now gone, perhaps forever. And that could have huge ramifications for a potential tilt at the presidency in 2024.
James Clayton there. Well, we can talk to Shoshana Zuboff, Professor Emeritus of Harvard Business School, author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Shoshana, do you think this was the right response from the Oversight Board, and do you think they got there in the right way?
Well, look, the Oversight Board was a creation of Facebook, not just newly formed, but actually funded by Facebook, $130 million to create it. And it's really a kind of PR device to help the company maintain this world that it's been living in without public law, without any kind of regulation. What happened today with their so-called decision was, we know that Facebook for many years indulged and appeased Mr. Trump with his increasingly incendiary messages on Facebook, because really it's an act of political appeasement. They're afraid of regulation, afraid of alienating Trump and his conservative allies. So Facebook really did very little over the many years and all those months leading up to the election when they could and should have acted. What this so-called Oversight Board did today was to kick the can back to Facebook.
Right.
To say to Facebook, what you did was unclear, it was vague, it really didn't correspond to your rule book, so you should take another look at it and figure it out in a way that actually corresponds to your rule book.
I mean,
So
you call
these
it... Sorry,
Yeah,
you call it a PR device, but it doesn't look as if it's working spectacularly well when you have this pincer movement of both left and right now telling you that Facebook's not functioning.
Well, what this comment and today really illustrates, Facebook is, chasing this committee that it created, looking for a way of covering up its lack of solutions, asking them for some kind of decision. And the Oversight Board is chasing Facebook. So you've got these folks, I picture them chasing each other on the rim of a donut. And the problem is they're looking for solutions, but the solution space is in the hole. And the real message that is uncovered by this bizarre situation today is that the only real solution for Facebook and the rest of social media, and indeed the tech sector, is that finally we as democracies must decide, and I mean citizens and lawmakers, we must decide how should communication work in this unprecedented medium that we call the internet.
Well,
we need a way of creating the rights and the laws and the new institutions that will make this new medium safe for democracy. That is not the case in Facebook. Facebook is a corporation with a very specific economic logic that has to extract behavioral data at scale.
Okay.
And the way they do that is to drive engagement.
But you know,
And
you know better than I do that Donald Trump's fans just say this kind of movement or move will embolden him. He will he will always find a way to talk to the millions of people that still support him, and it will be Facebook that's left out in the cold and not Donald Trump.
Well, I don't know who's saying that, but that is not a formulation I would agree with. Look, what the situation today does not deprive Mr. Trump of his freedom of speech. That is a profound misunderstanding. Mr. Trump can go anywhere that he is welcome, and he can say whatever he wants to say. He can stand in Hyde Park Corner and say what he wants to say. His freedom of speech is intact. What has changed is that Facebook is not a public sphere where free speech is welcome, because the idea in a public sphere is that the best ideas rise to the top.
Yeah.
Facebook is an economic juggernaut with very specific economic imperatives. They need to have a lot of engagement in order to extract a lot of data.
Shoshana?
And that means that they amplify the worst information, the most corrupt information, the most bizarre and inflammatory
Shoshana Zuboff,
information.
we're out of time. Thank you very much. Thank you.